morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to Polaris-Live. This is your host, Sarwar Kashmeri, inviting our viewers from around the world to join us in these conversations with global experts on the U.S.-China relationship, perhaps the most consequential foreign policy issue of our time. This program is brought to you in conjunction with the Foreign Policy Association. I have great pleasure today in welcoming as a guest to Polaris-Live, Ms. Bonnie Glaser, who is a senior advisor for Asia and the director of the China Power Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS, in Washington, D.C., where she works on issues related to Asia-Pacific security with a focus on Chinese foreign and security policy. She's concomitantly a non-resident fellow with the Lowy Institute in Sydney, Australia, and a senior associate with the Pacific Forum. Ms. Glaser has worked for more than 3 decades at the intersection of Asia-Pacific geopolitics and U.S. policy. Prior to joining CSIS, she consulted for both the Departments of Defense and State. Ms. Glaser has published widely, including the Washington Quarterly, China Quarterly, Asian Survey, International Security, Korean Journal of Defense Analysis, as well as in leading newspapers such as the New York Times, International Herald Tribune. She's currently a board member of the U.S. Committee for the Council of Security Cooperation in the Asia Pacific, and a member of both the Council of Foreign Relations and the International Institute for Strategic Studies. So please join me in welcoming one of the nation's foremost experts on national security and U.S. foreign policy, Ms. Bonnie Glaser. Bonnie, good morning.
Well, thank you for having me today.
Well, it's an absolute pleasure. What does it feel like this morning, sitting in the capital of the world?
Well, I'm outside in the suburbs, but it's a nice spring day, and I'm glad we are all through winter. There's a lot going on in the world, so I think we're all very busy.
Well, that's good, right? There's a lot going on in the world. But listen, I just read a headline this morning, and I thought I would start with that. So this is in the front page of the Financial Times. And I'll read it verbatim. UK defense chiefs are imposing sweeping cuts across all 3 armed services, retiring older tanks, warship, and aircraft, cutting thousands of soldiers in an effort to prepare for a new era of digital warfare. So my question to you is, here's the U.S. with 600 bases overseas. The admirals are going in for more aircraft carriers, which we are learning more and more would have to run for it if there was ever a conflict with China. So where are we with all these plans Mr. Biden is making to spend more trillions of dollars and so on? Do you think it's time for an overhaul of the Pentagon, the military posture of the U.S., and really taking a magnifying glass to all these expenses?
Well, I would just say that the Biden administration is in fact undergoing right now a global posture review. This is what Secretary of Defense Austin, one of the things that he is focused on, that will address issues of how we deploy our forces, whether we are appropriately postured, whether our posture is in line with our foreign policy priorities. And defense spending is going to be an aspect of that as well. But I think we can be confident that we're not going to see some of the increases that we've seen in the past few years. Whether defense spending is cut remains to be seen, but the United States is still a global power. We face global challenges, and the biggest one today is China. The Department of Defense has said China is our pacing threat. And if China is the pacing threat for all U.S. services, then it's hard to believe that the defense budget can decline significantly.
So, Bonnie, let me just tell you what I'm picking up, and that is that all these big platforms that the military has right? China's defense budget is what, a third roughly of the United States, and it's largely focused on denying access to their coastline. And from what I'm picking up, they've done it so well with layers of space, sea, land, missiles, rockets, that the U.S. Navy, in times of conflict, would not be able to approach within 1,000 kilometers of the coastline without getting sunk. So that being the case, what are we projecting? What kind of force, what kind of leverage do we have left as far as negotiations are concerned? Because it seems as though we have a military that was more suited to 20th century warfare than 21st century. What are you picking up, and what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I will say that I am primarily an expert on China, not on the United States and our military posture. But stay tuned. That's exactly what Secretary Austin is doing. There's going to be more dispersal. There will be more hardening. We will have more expeditionary units that will be deployed in various places in the Indo-Pacific. The Marines are leading in terms of development of operational concepts. So there will be, I think, a fundamental shift in the way that the U.S. postures its force in the Indo-Pacific, because there is a widely shared view that conventional deterrence is eroding for the reasons you say, because China can threaten any U.S. military assets that are operating within the First Island chain. So this is exactly what the U.S. military is currently focused on.
So let's focus on China a bit, since that's where your expertise and interests are. And what I'd like to ask you is, there are people who say that China is bent on pushing its ideology and becoming the hegemon on the world. There are others that say, no, China is basically interested in transforming itself, its people, that it wants to make sure that it doesn't ever have an invasion of its coastline, that its expansion is really more aimed at China than the rest of the world. Where do you come out on that debate, Bonnie?
Well, I think that China for years has been focused on promoting a positive narrative about China and snuffing out any criticism of China by other countries. And this has not gone away. The wolf warrior diplomacy has amplified this message. But I do think there is an element that is growing, that China does not want to see democracies succeed around the world. This is controversial among China experts. There are some who believe that China is, as you say, it's all about defending China and its reputation. But I would cite this, that years ago when China first started joining international institutions, and it joined the World Trade Organization, of course, even before that, the Non-Proliferation Treaty.
Right.
And China was a small player just participating. And in that world, China really did not need to shape the norms of the institutions. But if you fast forward to today, we know that one of Xi Jinping's leading goals is, and I use this term, it's prominent goals, one of the most important is to lead global governance reform. And it's interesting because when he first came to power, he said China should participate in global governance reform. And then he said China should guide this reform. And then finally, in June of 2018, he started using the term lead. It's quite unusual for China to lead anything in the international system. But this is now what Xi Jinping is trying to do. And it's my belief that China cannot effectively lead the international system unless it begins to insert its norms into that system. So we see this in the United Nations and the Human Rights Council, for example, where China is very actively trying to change the way the world thinks about human rights, saying it's not universally determined, but it's really should be defined as in terms of economic development, for example, not in terms of the freedoms of individuals. We also see during the pandemic where the Chinese are doing something similar to what the Russians are doing in their political, their disinformation activity abroad. And that is, it's telling the world, and particularly Americans, that Western developed vaccines are not safe, that they're killing people. Why? Because China wants the United States to continue to be mired in the pandemic, because that's good for China. Right. So I believe that there are some activities that China is engaged in that are signaling that we should be more worried than we were in the past about China's ambitions in the international system.
So, Bonnie, let me follow up on that a bit. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank that China was instrumental in setting up, right? It was set up because there was a feeling, at least in China and some of the surrounding countries, that the World Bank and the IMF were not making enough money available for infrastructure in Asia, because of their focus on job creation and free markets and capitalism. And so there was this need for all of this infrastructure money. So can it not also be that the world order, as it was designed after the Second World War, is really straining to keep up with this age where it's Asia that's the driving force, where the Asians, a lot of them need this money that China. So could it not be that China is really pushing to change the world order to bring it more in line with where reality is today, rather than lead, but lead in changing, not lead as in we'll run the world order? What do you think about that?
Well, I do think that if China is modifying the international system, which I think it is in a very sort of gradual way, it's because it wants to adjust it. It wants to make changes. In some areas, I think it does want to lead. I don't think necessarily it wants to dominate, but, one step at a time. We can't rule that out. It may be that China wants to be the hegemon in its own region today and eventually wants to be more dominant globally. Look, Xi Jinping won't be in power forever, so we'll have to see what the next leader stands for. But I do want to say something about the AIIB. If China's ambition in creating the AIIB was to provide infrastructure for Asia, and maybe a sort of broader region around China's periphery and help its neighbors, right, then that's not what the AIIB is doing, right? I mean, the funding for most of the Belt and Road projects is coming from China's Development Bank and China's Exim Bank, not from the AIIB. And I know in regards to India, yes, there are some loans that are coming from the AIIB, but this is most of the projects are not being funded through that bank. So we still have to ask the question as to why did China create the AIIB, and is it in fact functioning in the way that the Chinese originally conceived that it was going to? Because Chinese probably didn't expect that Western countries would sign up in such large numbers. And of course, the United States was opposed to it at the time. And ultimately, I think that this bank has shaped up in a way that perhaps wasn't quite exactly what China originally conceived.
Okay. It's please allow me to shift the topic a little bit. I'm going to focus on the South China Sea, right, and the East China Sea. And I want to just get your opinion on the American ratification of the Law of the Sea Treaty. And just to explain to those people who are not familiar with it, that this is the UN treaty that was worked out over many years. Everybody in the and it defines how much of waters and so on are owned by countries. And it's been ratified by every country with the exception of Egypt, Sudan, and the United States. And even though our defense intelligence people would like for America to ratify it, the Senate has not done so. So can't people from around the world say, hey, where do you go around throwing your weight and saying China doesn't own this, China doesn't own that, if you're not even going to ratify this treaty that the rest of the world has? Do you think it's time that we just get that done?
Well, it's absolutely time for the United States to ratify the Convention on the Law of the Sea, and it's something I've advocated for many years.
Yes.
Very controversial in the United States. But I think we have to be clear that the United States observes UNCLOS as a matter of customary law. So the United States does not say we won't ratify, we won't abide by it. In fact, it's somewhat ironic. China is a signatory, but it violates UNCLOS. The United States is not a signatory, but we abide by it. So, U.S. military commanders and forces are instructed to adhere to the convention. U.S. freedom of navigation operations are very carefully crafted to be consistent with UNCLOS. Right. So, the United States demonstrates support for the convention's legal regime through its actions as a coastal state. So that obviously it includes respecting all of the rights, the freedoms, the lawful uses of the sea and airspace that's exercised by other states. And I should note that when vessels and aircraft from foreign militaries, including not only China, but also Russia, conduct military activities in and over the U.S. exclusive economic zone, the U.S. states publicly that this is lawful use of the sea. We do not criticize Russian ships that conduct, for example, innocent passage through any of our even territorial waters. Right. And China has done so. So the U.S. is not being hypocritical or contradictory. There are persisting concerns that I think are not particularly valid, but they are still held, especially among Republicans. And so even when President Obama said that we should prioritize joining the convention, it was not high on his list of legislative priorities. Right. And so it just didn't happen. And my guess is, even though it's possible now that we have a democratically dominated Congress in both houses and a Democratic president, it could happen, but nobody's talking about that because there's so many other legislative priorities.
Well, listen, I mean, you're the most influential voice there, so do something.
I wish.
Now, listen, Bonnie, one thing I'd like for you really to help me clarify, and that is, we do these freedom of navigation exercises, right? We want to let China know that, hey, listen, these sea lanes are going to be available to everybody forever, as long as it's legal to do so. But my question is this: over 70%, 75% of China's exports, energy imports come through these sea lanes. Why would China ever want to block them? Makes no sense, does it?
Well, I don't think that the main issue is China blocking the sea lanes. I think it is China coercing other countries in peacetime who have the right to develop energy and have access to fish and resources within their exclusive economic zones. So I think the problems begin in peacetime, not even before we get to talking about what they might do in wartime.
Right.
And I think those are the biggest problems, that China is actually trying to effectively control and dominate all of the activities within these waters. In a real conflict, China, as you said earlier, would want to keep the United States out of all of the waters that are close to its coastline.
Right.
And the South China Sea would be an access point of an attack potentially on China. And under those circumstances, yes, I think China might seek to try and block countries from operating in and entering the South China Sea. In peacetime, I agree with you. It makes no sense, but we have bigger problems in peacetime.
Got it. Thank you for that explanation. Makes a great deal of sense. And what I'd like to do, we have about 10 minutes or so remaining. I want to talk a little bit about the Quad. And again, this is, short for quadrilateral dialogue. I had to think back, Bonnie, to my high school geometry days to think about a quadrilateral. But what I want, so this is a grouping that has been set up as a counter to China's influence, right? And it's America, Japan, Australia, and India, right? So the first question for you is that you have people like India in it who have this age-old historical abhorrence in, I'm going to switch this off, who have this age-old abhorrence in alliances, military alliances, colonial history, and so on. So what is the Quad? Is the Quad an alliance? Is it a grouping of countries? Is it aimed at China? Can you just explain to our viewers in simple words what the Quad is?
Well, the Quad really started after the nuclear crisis that took place in Fukushima in Japan, and the cooperation among the four countries, to help Japan. And I think that was really primarily the genesis of the organization. So it's really disaster relief. And then Australia had some doubts about participating. Because I think it was concerned about China's negative reaction. I think that ultimately led India to feel like it was being left to perhaps to hang out to dry, not having the cover of Australia. And the Quad did not do much for about a 10-year period. And I think the reason that it has revived is in large part because of concerns about China. We are at a moment where Japan and India, the United States, and Australia are really very closely aligned in their concerns about China. At the same time, none of those countries want to call it an anti-China alliance or even an anti-China coalition. But there is willingness now to do more, not only to have low-level diplomatic meetings, but also to have our leaders have a virtual summit.
Right. Right.
And of course, in the Malabar exercise, all four countries participated for the first time. So from my perspective, the Quad is ideally suited to demonstrate that democratic countries can act collectively to provide peace and security, to help bolster that, and to solve some regional and global problems. And in the recent summit, that was the virtual summit, as you know, there was a decision to collaborate to provide vaccines to other countries. And I think
Indeed.
this is an ideal function of the Quad. China has presented itself as a world's provider of COVID-19 vaccines, and now the Quad countries are bringing together patents and financing and manufacturing and logistic capabilities to provide vaccines. So it isn't anti-China, but it's also showing that democratic countries can indeed provide solutions to regional and global problems. And I think it's important to note the Quad is really not likely going to develop into an Asian NATO that will come to other countries' defense.
Interesting.
This is not the direction the Quad is going, but it can bolster the rules-based order, defend freedom of navigation, protect supply chains. So, and importantly, individually and jointly, we can show that democracy as a political system hasn't failed. And we can provide better solutions than China's authoritarian system, because the Chinese are telling the world that democracy has failed and their system works better. And that's really quite worrisome to me. And I know it's worrisome to senior Biden administration officials as well.
Well, I think that is one of the best explanations that I've heard of the Quad, and I'll pick up on one of the points you made, that China is telling the world that its system is better at solving problems. I mean, I might even go further, that we are seeing real firsthand that it is solving problems that democracies, the U.S. specifically, right now. Just take one case. One of our historian guests on Polaris-Live said, in the 3,000-year Chinese history, the last 40 years have been the most successful, when it's raised most of its people from a level of poverty. And then compared it to what's happened in America over the last 40 years, where the middle class has been stagnant or going down. So I totally agree with you, but that it's really important to show that democracies can indeed, and I hope this is true, work out problems. And so I'm glad that you phrased it in those terms, because another one of our guests said, we were talking about China, how efficiently they do things. And he said, I've traveled all over Asia, and Asians love the high-speed trains. They love how China solves problems. But he said, I haven't met a single Asian who wants to live in the Chinese system. Which I thought was a wonderful way of bringing across what you've just said. So the follow-up question on the Quad would be, Bonnie, do we lose something if we haven't included other Asian countries in the Quad, or do you think at this point we just need to lead with the four?
Well, there is an active effort not to expand the Quad formally, but more informally. And this is what everybody refers to as the Quad Plus agenda. Countries that are interested in participating in some Quad activities are welcome to join. And I think ideally the way to do this is to have different coalitions. If we insist that every country that wants to work with the Quad in some way has to work with the Quad in every activity, then most countries will stay apart from it. But if we say, well, if you're just interested in doing this activity with us, but you don't want to do that one, whatever that happens to be,
right,
then that's fine. So the UK is very interested. And I think there are other countries in Asia that think that they might be sort of a Quad Plus member. So we have to be open, flexible, transparent, and let countries do whatever suits their own comfort level.
Right.
And there will be some that are going to be very reluctant, but even so, will be very happy that the Quad and other countries are working together in their backyard.
It's I had a question prepared to end our conversation with Bonnie, but I've just received I saw a message come through from one of our viewers, and I want to pick this one out. I thought it might give you just the right touch as a thank you. So this message says, Madam Bonnie, West politics and media is so biased to me. They simply do not understand China. To me, China has not officially said democracy failed. And what do you have to say about all that? So I'm going to let you answer this provocative question as we end our program, Bonnie.
So I will say I consider myself to be an objective analysis on China. You can go on my website, China Power, and find all sorts of objective analysis of where China's strengths are as a power, where its weaknesses are, where it's narrowing the gap, and where it lags behind, including its own domestic development. But I would say in response explicitly to that question that if you read the writings and statements and speeches by Xi Jinping, if you follow closely what China's actions are, then I think that you have to conclude that China wants to see itself succeed. It wants to be able to help other countries succeed, but it sees the United States and the West and democracies, I believe, as a threat. And I don't see that China's entire foreign policy is aimed at undermining democracy. I don't think that's its top priority either. But I think we are seeing Xi Jinping say, go back to the, for example, 2013 speech that he made, which was made public only later, in which Xi Jinping talked about how socialism will eventually prevail over capitalism.
Mm.
So in order for China to succeed, I believe that they have to show that their system works best. And let's not forget that at the 19th Party Congress, Xi Jinping also said that China's development path presents a model for other countries. So we can debate whether that means China is explicitly exporting its model, but it is certainly promoting components of its model, including authoritarian techniques, which some countries may just use to, like surveillance, to fight crime, but others may use for other purposes that undermine freedoms. And that's worrisome to democracies.
Bonnie Glaser from CSIS, I really want to thank you for taking part of this conversation. As usual, you were clear, succinct, forthright, all the things you're so well known for. And so let me tell our viewers from around the world that this is Polaris-Live. And I hope that you've enjoyed today's conversation about U.S.-China relationship. Please go to my website, www.kashmeri.com, where you will find a list of upcoming guests. And also, I would love your support in registering for it. That's all the time we have. So until next Tuesday, when I hope to see you, goodbye.